Almost 200 years ago, in 1829, the Swan River colony was established in Western Australia. Within the first 5 years, WA had its first brewery, and by the end of the century, business was booming. The beer I have here has become somewhat of a cultural icon, still a West Aussie beer long after the departure over east. WA beer has an interesting and intertwining story. Today I'm going to tell that story. Beer arrived in Australia at the beginning of British colonisation. Captain James Cook brought beer with him on his ship the Endeavour as a means of preserving drinking water. This was at the recommendation of Nathaniel Hume. He suggested that by bringing molasses and turpentine on board, the bad water could be brewed into safe drinking beer. Beer was still being consumed 2 years later in 1770 when Cook discovered the east coast of Australia. The story of beer in WA is complex and intrinsic and has had quite an effect on identity, culture and politics. Emu beer has the longest history in WA. In 1834, a man by the name of James Stokes migrated to the Swan River colony in WA. At this time, the colony was suffering from chronic drunkenness due to the high volume of spirits within the colony. James Stokes saw an opportunity. By opening a brewery, he could make use of the low tax on locally produced beer while helping with the drunken problem. So in 1837, at the foot of Spring Street and Mounts Bay Road, he opened the Albion Brewery. The business took off, and by 1839, it was doing so well that Stokes mortgaged the property in order to extend to the waterfront. It was at this time he would join in an ill-fated partnership with Dubois Aguette, who soon after maimed himself in a suicide attempt, quickly ending that joint venture. We skip ahead to 1848, and Stokes was interested in lobbying for convict transport to deal with the labour shortage. It was in that same year that the Albion Brewery changed its name to the Stanley Brewery. In 1857, James Stokes returned to England and married his cousin. Soon after, Stokes and his bride came back to the brewery, with Mrs. Stokes bearing a child. Sadly, Mrs. Stokes died during childbirth, along with the child. James lost interest in brewing and died shortly after. John Maxwell Ferguson became the new owner of Stanley Brewery. He recruited a German brewer by the name of William Mumm. The old Stanley recipe changed many times as the business continued to change hands. In 1880, an ice house and malt house were added to the main Stanley building. At the turn of the century, Stanley Brewery was given a public offering and became the Stanley Cooperative Brewery Limited. Finally, in 1908, Stanley was rebranded under its most successful beverage, to the Emu Brewery. Business continued to grow until it was taken over by its previous rival, the Swan Brewery, although it continued to operate as a separate business. The Albion Brewery had almost monopolised brewing in Western Australia until 1857, with the establishment of the Swan Brewery. In 1843, Frederick Sherwood migrated to Western Australia with the money passed on to him by his father, the owner of a successful building firm in England. By 1857, he had successfully established a new brewery at what is now known as Sherwood Court. He named it the Swan Brewery, after the black swans common to the area. The Swan Brewery ran in competition with the Stanley Brewery until Frederick died in 1874. When the family leased the brewery, it was taken over by the Stanley Brewery's previous owners, Ferguson and Mumm. In 1879, the Swan Brewery moved to the foot of Mount Eliza, which caused outrage in the indigenous population, as that area was attributed to a Dreamtime ancestor known as Wagal. and the Swan Brewery itself was on the sacred site of Goonennup. By 1888, Swan had successfully negotiated the takeover of the recently established Lion Brewery. A successful public offering in the early 1900s meant that the business for Swan Brewery was booming. This led to the eventual takeover of the Emu Brewery. Brewing assisted in migration, shaped the landscape, and built one of the most resilient industries in the period of settlement. It affected politics through processes of lobbying, and in a way was a social service. It wasn't without fault, as it negatively impacted the indigenous culture. Well, that's it from us this week. Tune in next week for the 20th century brewing in Western Australia.